Berlin, April 1945. A man walks out of the Reich Air Ministry carrying blueprints that could have won the war. No one stops him. No one asks his name. He vanishes into the smoke and chaos of a collapsing empire, and with him goes the most complete intelligence package ever stolen from Nazi Germany. Detailed schematics, test data, and tactical assessments of the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. His identity remains unknown, his fate a mystery. But the documents he carried reached Allied hands within weeks, and they changed aviation history forever. This is the story of the forgotten spy who stole Hitler's jet plans and disappeared into legend. The Me 262 was not supposed to exist. In 1938, when Willy Messerschmitt first proposed a twin-engine jet fighter to the Reich Air Ministry, conventional wisdom said it was impossible. Jet propulsion was theoretical. Metallurgy couldn't handle the temperatures. Fuel consumption would be catastrophic. But Messerschmitt had seen the future. He had studied the work of Hans von Ohain, whose turbojet engine had powered the Heinkel He 178 in August 1939, the first jet aircraft flight in history. Von Ohain's design was crude, inefficient, and lasted only 10 minutes in the air. But it proved the concept. Messerschmitt began work immediately. By 1940, his team had produced the first prototype airframe. It looked unlike anything else in the sky: swept wings, twin engines mounted beneath in streamlined nacelles, a needle nose, and a cockpit positioned high and forward for visibility. The aircraft was designated Project 1065, but there were no engines. The Junkers Jumo 004 turbojets, designed specifically for the project, were still in development. Engineers struggled with turbine blade failures, combustion instability, and fuel flow issues. Early prototypes destroyed themselves after minutes of operation. So Messerschmitt did something audacious. He mounted a single Junkers Jumo 210 piston engine in the nose of the prototype just to test the aerodynamics. On April 18, 1941, test pilot Fritz Wendel took the makeshift hybrid into the air over Augsburg. It flew beautifully. The airframe was ready. Now they just needed engines that wouldn't explode. The Jumo 004 was a masterpiece of desperation engineering. Traditional turbine blades were made from heat-resistant nickel alloys, but by 1942, Germany's nickel supplies were nearly exhausted. Engineers substituted mild steel coated with aluminum, knowing full well the blades would warp and crack after 25 hours of use. They didn't care. The goal was to get the engine into production, not to make it last. A jet fighter that flew for 25 hours was better than a jet fighter that never flew at all. On July 18, 1942, the Me 262 V3 prototype took off from Leipheim with two Jumo 004 engines. It reached a speed of 540 miles per hour, faster than any Allied fighter in existence. The aircraft could climb at 3,900 feet per minute. Its service ceiling was 37,500 feet. At altitude, it was untouchable. But development was agonizingly slow. Each test flight revealed new problems. The engines flamed out during hard maneuvering. The landing gear collapsed under the weight of a full fuel load. The guns jammed from vibration. Messerschmitt's engineers worked through each issue methodically. They reinforced the landing gear struts. They redesigned the fuel flow regulators. They added dampers to the gun mounts. By late 1943, the aircraft was finally approaching operational readiness, and then Hitler saw it. The demonstration took place at Insterburg, East Prussia, on November 26, 1943. Hitler had been reluctant to visit. He distrusted new technology and had been burned before by overly optimistic promises from aircraft designers. But his armaments minister, Albert Speer, insisted. Messerschmitt himself was there, along with Erhard Milch, the Luftwaffe's chief procurement officer. Test pilot Gerd Lindner took the Me 262 through its paces. He accelerated down the runway, lifted off, and climbed steeply. At 3,000 feet, he leveled out and opened the throttles. The jet screamed past the reviewing stand at over 500 miles per hour. the roar of its engines arriving seconds after the aircraft itself. Hitler watched in silence. Lindner brought the aircraft around for a second pass, this time flying at low altitude to demonstrate its speed. The jet was a blur, visible for only a few seconds before it disappeared into the distance. When it landed, Hitler approached Messerschmitt with a question. "Can this aircraft carry bombs?" Messerschmitt hesitated. The Me-262 had been designed as an interceptor, optimized for speed and climb rate to destroy Allied bombers. Adding bomb racks would compromise its aerodynamics and reduce its effectiveness. But Hitler insisted. He envisioned the Me-262 as a fast bomber, a blitz bomber, capable of striking Allied positions in France with impunity. He believed that Germany's salvation lay not in defensive operations, but in offensive strikes that would demoralize the enemy. He ordered that all production models be configured for ground attack. The decision was catastrophic. Engineers scrambled to redesign the airframe. Bomb racks were added beneath the fuselage, capable of carrying two 550-pound bombs. The center of gravity shifted. Handling characteristics changed. Months of testing had to be repeated. Production, already delayed by Allied bombing raids on Jumo factories, ground nearly to a halt. Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most experienced fighter pilots and the inspector of fighters for the Luftwaffe, argued vehemently against the decision. He knew the Me-262's true value lay in its ability to intercept and destroy the massive bomber formations that were systematically destroying German industrial capacity. Hitler refused to listen. By June 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, fewer than 30 Me-262s had been delivered to operational units. The Luftwaffe had the fastest fighter in the world, but it couldn't use it. The Allies knew about the Me-262 long before it entered service. British intelligence had received fragmented reports as early as 1943, sightings of strange engineless aircraft over Bavaria, rumors of turbine propulsion, references in captured documents to Project 1065. But the reports were contradictory. Some sources claimed the aircraft could reach 600 miles per hour. Others said it was unstable and prone to engine fires. No one knew how many existed or when they might become operational. The uncertainty was maddening. Intelligence analysts at RAF Medmenham, the Photographic Reconnaissance Interpretation Center, pored over thousands of aerial photographs looking for any evidence of jet production. They tracked construction at known Messerschmitt facilities. They monitored railway shipments. They interrogated captured Luftwaffe personnel. In the spring of 1944, a reconnaissance Spitfire photographed a Me-262 on the runway at Lechfeld Airfield. The image was grainy, taken from 30,000 feet, but analysts could see the distinctive shape, the swept wings, the engine nacelles, the absence of a propeller. It was the confirmation they'd been dreading. The Germans had a jet fighter, and it was operational. The RAF launched a series of preemptive strikes. On May 25, 1944, Allied bombers hit the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg. More than 400 B-17s dropped over 1,000 tons of bombs. Production lines were shattered, partially assembled airframes were buried under rubble. Critical tooling was destroyed. A second raid hit the Junkers engine plant at Dessau on May 29th. A third struck the assembly facility at Augsburg on June 13th. The campaign was devastatingly effective. Me-262 production, which had been projected to reach 100 aircraft per month by mid-1944, collapsed to a trickle. But the strikes came too late. By then, the Germans had already dispersed production to underground facilities. Assembly lines were moved into forests, mines, and converted railroad tunnels. Components were manufactured in dozens of small workshops scattered across southern Germany. Slave laborers from concentration camps worked around the clock to meet Hitler's impossible quotas. The Me-262 program continued, and somewhere inside that fragmented, brutal system, a spy was watching. We don't know his name. We don't know his nationality. Records suggest he may have been a Polish engineer, conscripted into forced labor and assigned to a technical drafting office in Berlin. Some accounts place him as a low-level German bureaucrat, disillusioned by the war and motivated by conscience. Others speculate he was a deep-cover Soviet agent inserted years earlier and activated only in the final months of the conflict. What we know for certain is this. In early April 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, someone walked into the Reich Air Ministry at Leipziger Strasse 5 and removed a complete dossier on the Me-262 program. The building itself was in chaos. Soviet artillery was falling on the eastern suburbs. Ministry staff were evacuating to makeshift offices in Bavaria. Filing cabinets stood open, their contents scattered across floors. Entire departments had simply abandoned their posts. In that environment, security had become meaningless. The dossier he took contained blueprints, performance data, combat reports, tactical assessments from Luftwaffe pilots who had flown the aircraft in combat. Test results from the Reckland Flight Test Center, including detailed measurements of engine thrust at various altitudes, fuel consumption rates, and structural load limits. Detailed schematics of the Jumo 004 engine, including the exact metallurgical composition of the turbine blades and combustion chamber linings. Manufacturing tolerances for critical components, quality control protocols, even the specifications for the specialized tools required to assemble the engines. It was, in essence, the entire institutional knowledge of Germany's jet fighter program, compiled in a single package. The theft went unnoticed. Or perhaps it was noticed but deemed irrelevant. By April 1945, Berlin was a city in terminal collapse. Ministries were evacuating. Files were being burned. Entire departments had ceased to function. In the chaos, one man with a briefcase could walk out a door and never be questioned. He crossed the front lines. How, we don't know. The journey would have been extraordinarily dangerous. Berlin was surrounded by Soviet forces. The only escape routes led west, through combat zones where retreating Wehrmacht units mixed with desperate civilians fleeing the Red Army. Some reports suggest he reached American forces near Magdeburg, roughly 90 miles west of Berlin. The Elbe River formed the demarcation line between Soviet and American zones. Thousands of refugees were crossing daily, often under fire. Others place him with British units advancing through northern Germany. There are even unconfirmed accounts of the documents appearing in Soviet hands first, only to be traded to the West through intelligence backchannels. The most plausible scenario is that he made contact with an established intelligence network, perhaps the Gehlen Organization, a group of former Wehrmacht intelligence officers who had begun cooperating with American forces even before the war ended. What matters is that by late April, the dossier was in Allied possession, and it was intact. The Me-262 entered combat in earnest in October 1944. By then, the Luftwaffe had finally accumulated enough aircraft and trained pilots to form dedicated jet fighter units. The most famous was Jagdverband 44, commanded by Adolf Galland, a legendary fighter ace who had been fired as inspector of fighters after clashing with Göring over tactics. Galland's unit was small, never more than 40 pilots, but it was composed entirely of veterans, men with hundreds of hours of combat experience and dozens of kills to their names. They flew from Munich-Riem Airport, and they were devastatingly effective. The tactics were simple but required extraordinary precision. Me-262 pilots would wait at high altitude above the American bomber formations. When the bombers appeared, the jets would dive at full throttle, building speed to over 500 miles per hour. At that velocity, the closure rate was overwhelming. American gunners barely had time to register the threat before the Me-262 was among them, firing its 430mm Mk-108 cannons. Each cannon fired 650 rounds per minute. The shells were explosive, designed to shred bombers with minimal hits. A single well-placed burst could destroy a B-17. After the attack, the jet would use its momentum to climb away, back to altitude, before the escort fighters could react. The Americans called it the zoom and boom. It was brutally efficient. On March 18, 1945, a formation of 37 Me-262s attacked a stream of American B-17 bombers over Bavaria. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. 12 bombers were destroyed. 2 more were damaged beyond repair and crashed attempting to land. The Americans had no effective counter. Allied fighters, P-51 Mustangs, Spitfires, P-47 Thunderbolts, could barely catch the Me-262 in level flight. At full throttle, the jet could reach 540 miles per hour, more than 100 miles per hour, faster than the fastest piston-engine fighter. But speed wasn't the real problem. The problem was acceleration. The Jumo 004 engines took several seconds to spool up from idle to full power. Once at speed, the Me-262 was untouchable, but if caught slow, it was vulnerable. Allied pilots learned to attack the jets during takeoff and landing when they were slow and vulnerable. Squadrons began loitering near known Me-262 bases, waiting for the jets to return low on fuel. It was dangerous work. The Germans responded by heavily fortifying their airfields with anti-aircraft guns. Approaching a Me-262 base at low altitude was often suicidal. Dozens of Allied fighters were lost in these low-level attacks. But it was the only tactic that worked. By April 1945, Allied fighter pilots had developed a grim nickname for the Me-262 bases: rat traps. You could kill the rats, but the trap might kill you first. The stolen plans arrived at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, in May 1945. American engineers had already examined captured Me-262 airframes. Several complete aircraft had been seized at Lechfeld and other bases as Allied forces advanced into Bavaria. Test pilots had flown them. Structural engineers had disassembled them. Metallurgists had analyzed their materials. But this was different. The blueprints included details that couldn't be reverse engineered from a physical aircraft: design tolerances, material specifications, manufacturing processes, stress calculations, wind tunnel data, test flight reports. The Jumo 004 engine schematics were especially valuable. American jet engine development had been proceeding independently, based primarily on British designs. Frank Whittle's turbojet patents had been shared with the United States in 1941, and General Electric had begun developing the IA engine shortly thereafter. But progress was slow. The General Electric IA turbojet produced only 1,300 pounds of thrust, barely half the output of the Jumo 004. American engines were more reliable, with service lives measured in hundreds of hours rather than 25, but they lacked power. Now, suddenly, American engineers had a complete roadmap. They studied the combustion chamber design, which used a reverse flow pattern to improve fuel atomization. They examined the fuel injection system, which employed a sophisticated metering valve to maintain optimal mixture ratios across varying altitudes and throttle settings. They analyzed the variable area nozzle, which automatically adjusted exhaust flow to maximize thrust. They were particularly impressed by the axial flow compressor arrangement. The Jumo 004 used an 8-stage compressor that achieved a pressure ratio of 3.14 to 1, significantly higher than contemporary Allied designs. This higher compression ratio translated directly into greater power output. They didn't copy it directly. German engineering had been constrained by material shortages and shortcuts that American industry didn't need to replicate. The mild steel turbine blades, for instance, were a weakness. American engineers could use proper nickel alloys, but they learned from it. They adopted the axial flow compressor configuration. They incorporated the combustion chamber geometry. They refined the fuel control system based on German innovations. Within 2 years, General Electric had developed the J-47 turbojet, producing 5,200 pounds of thrust. It was reliable, efficient, and powerful enough to propel aircraft past the speed of sound. It powered the F-86 Sabre, the fighter that would dominate the skies over Korea. The British did the same. Rolls-Royce engineers incorporated lessons from the Me-262 into the Nene and Derwent engines, which powered the Gloucester Meteor and later the de Havilland Vampire. The Meteor had already been in limited service since 1944, but it was slower than the Me-262 and saw little combat. The captured German data allowed British engineers to dramatically improve performance. Soviet engineers, working from their own captured materials, developed the Klimov VK-1, essentially a reverse-engineered copy of the Rolls-Royce Nene, which the British had foolishly sold to the Soviets in 1946. It powered the MiG-15, arguably the most important jet fighter of the early Cold War. When American pilots first encountered MiG-15s over Korea in November 1950, they were shocked by the aircraft's performance. It could outclimb the F-86. It had a higher service ceiling. Its armament, two 23mm cannons and one 37mm cannon, was devastating. The genealogy was clear. The MiG-15's swept wings came from German research. Its engine was British, derived from German principles. Its tactics echoed the zoom and boom methods pioneered by Me-262 pilots. Every major jet program of the post-war era bore traces of German engineering. But the source documents, the plans that made it all possible, had come from a single briefcase carried out of Berlin by a man whose name no one recorded. The Luftwaffe built 1,430 Me-262s between 1944 and 1945. Fewer than 300 saw combat. The rest were destroyed on the ground by Allied bombing, abandoned for lack of fuel, or scuttled by retreating German forces. Chronic fuel shortages plagued the program from the beginning. The Jumo 004 consumed fuel at an alarming rate. The aircraft's endurance was barely 60 minutes. By early 1945, Germany's synthetic fuel plants were being systematically destroyed by Allied bombers. Many Me-262s never left their airfields. They sat on runways, fully armed and fueled, waiting for missions that never came because there was no fuel for the next sortie. Pilot training was equally problematic. The Me-262 required a completely different skill set than piston engine fighters. Pilots had to learn to manage engine spool-up times, to avoid high G maneuvers that could cause engine flameouts, to judge attack angles at speeds they'd never experienced before. Training took time, and by late 1944, time was the one resource Germany no longer had. New pilots were rushed through abbreviated training programs. Some had fewer than 10 hours in the aircraft before being sent into combat. Many died in their first engagements, killed not by enemy fire but by their own inexperience. The aircraft's impact on the war was negligible. It arrived too late in too few numbers, flown by pilots with too little training and too few resources. But its impact on history was profound. The Me-262 proved that jet propulsion was viable for military aviation. It demonstrated that swept-wing designs could achieve transonic speeds without catastrophic instability. It showed that traditional piston-engine fighters were obsolete, rendered irrelevant overnight by a fundamental technological shift. Allied intelligence had suspected these things, but suspicion is not knowledge. The stolen plans converted suspicion into certainty. They provided the data, the measurements, the equations that allowed Western engineers to leapfrog years of trial and error development. And the spy who made it possible? He was never identified. No post-war government claimed him. No agency took credit. No memoir or declassified file ever revealed his name. In the decades after the war, historians tried to piece together the story. They interviewed former Luftwaffe pilots, engineers, and ministry officials. They combed through captured German records, now scattered across archives in Washington, London, and Moscow. A few fragments emerged. A reference in a 1947 debriefing report to a source inside the RLM who provided comprehensive technical documentation in April 1945. A note in British intelligence files mentioning a German-speaking individual of uncertain loyalty who had crossed lines near Magdeburg carrying materials of significant aeronautical value. A Soviet file, partially declassified in 1991, that mentioned acquisition of enemy jet fighter plans through a confidential source, identity withheld. None of the references provided a name. Some researchers speculated it wasn't a single individual at all, that the documents had been compiled from multiple sources, stitched together by intelligence analysts to create a coherent picture. But that theory doesn't fit the evidence. The dossier was too complete, too organized. It read like an internal briefing document prepared for senior officials who needed to understand the program in full. The pages were numbered sequentially. The technical drawings bore consistent date stamps and revision numbers. This was an intact archive, not a patchwork compilation. Someone had access, someone took it, someone got it out. The most compelling theory, advanced by intelligence historian Michael Mueller in his 2003 book, Shadow Agents of the Reich, suggests the spy was a technical officer in the RLM's Aeronautical Engineering Division, someone with legitimate access to classified materials who had become disillusioned with the Nazi regime. Mueller identified 3 possible candidates, all technical officers who disappeared from records in April 1945. One was Hans-Georg Kruger, a structural engineer who had worked on stress calculations for the Me-262 airframe. He vanished from Berlin in mid-April. His fate is unknown. Another was Ernst Waldmann, a propulsion specialist who had coordinated testing at Rechlin. Records show he was present at a meeting on April 10, 1945, but absent from all subsequent documentation. The third was a Polish engineer named Tadeusz Kowalski, conscripted into German service in 1940. He had training in mechanical engineering from Warsaw Polytechnic and was assigned to the RLM's technical library, where he would have had access to comprehensive documentation. Kowalski's name appears on personnel rosters through March 1945, then disappears. No death certificate was ever filed. No post-war records place him in either Poland or Germany. He simply ceased to exist in any official capacity. Mueller believed Kowalski was the most likely candidate. As a Pole working under duress for the Nazi regime, he had both motive and opportunity. His position in the technical library would have given him access to exactly the kind of comprehensive documentation that appeared in Allied hands. But Mueller never found conclusive proof. And without a confession, a testimony, or contemporary documentation explicitly naming the source, the identity remains speculation. The greatest irony is that the Me-262 might have changed the war if deployed differently. Adolf Galland believed that 300 Me-262s used exclusively as interceptors could have stopped the American daylight bombing campaign. The math supported him. In early 1945, the Americans were flying approximately 1,000 heavy bomber sorties per day over Germany. Each sortie involved dozens of aircraft in tight formation. And Me-262 could destroy 2 or 3 bombers per mission with relative impunity. 300 jets, flying 2 missions per day, could theoretically shoot down over 1,000 bombers per week. The losses would have been unsustainable. The Americans would have been forced to curtail or abandon daylight operations, giving German industry desperately needed breathing room. But Hitler's bomber obsession prevented this. By insisting the Me-262 be used for ground attack, he guaranteed the aircraft would never be available in sufficient numbers to defend the Reich. Even after the bomber mandate was quietly abandoned in late 1944, it was too late. Production had been delayed by months. Pilots hadn't been trained. Tactical doctrines hadn't been developed. The opportunity was lost. Some historians argue the Me-262 couldn't have changed the outcome regardless of deployment. By 1944, Germany was losing the war on every front. Soviet forces were approaching from the east. Allied armies had liberated France and were advancing into Germany from the west. The industrial base was collapsing. Fuel supplies were dwindling. A few hundred jet fighters couldn't reverse those realities, but they might have prolonged the war. And in 1945, Every additional month of fighting meant thousands more deaths in concentration camps, thousands more civilian casualties from bombing raids, and potentially catastrophic complications for post-war reconstruction. The spy who stole the plans may have understood this. By ensuring the Allied powers had complete technical knowledge of Germany's most advanced weapon, he eliminated any possibility that Hitler could use the Me-262 as a bargaining chip in negotiations. There would be no Nazi redoubt in the Alps, defended by jet fighters the Allies couldn't match. There would be no conditional surrender based on technological superiority. The war would end completely, unconditionally, as it had to. By 1950, the Me-262 had been relegated to museums and scrapyards. A handful survived as display pieces. The Smithsonian acquired one for the National Air and Space Museum. The RAF Museum preserved another. The Deutsches Museum in Munich displayed a third. Most were simply scrapped for metal. The jet age it inaugurated had moved on. Speeds had doubled. Engines had tripled in power. Swept wings and afterburners were standard. Radar-guided missiles replaced cannons. But the engineers who built those new aircraft never forgot where the knowledge came from. Kelly Johnson, the legendary designer of the Lockheed F-80 Shooting Star and later the F-104 Starfighter, kept a photograph of a Me-262 on his office wall. When asked why, he reportedly said, "To remind me that we didn't invent this." We learned it. Soviet designers were less sentimental but no less aware. The MiG-15, which shocked Western air forces in Korea with its speed and climb rate, owed much of its conceptual lineage to German research. Soviet engineers had studied captured Me-262s extensively, measuring every dimension, testing every material, analyzing every design choice. Even the American B-47 Stratojet, the first swept-wing strategic bomber, incorporated aerodynamic principles validated by Me-262 testing. Boeing engineers had access to German wind tunnel data showing how swept wings delayed the onset of compressibility effects at high subsonic speeds. The lineage was undeniable, and at the root of it all was a single act of espionage, executed in the final days of a dying regime by someone whose motivations we can only guess at. Was he an idealist, hoping to prevent the technology from being used for further destruction? A pragmatist, betting on the winning side and hoping for favorable treatment after the war? A patriot, secretly working for his occupied homeland and seeking revenge against the regime that had enslaved his people? Or simply a man who saw an opportunity and took it without grand ideology or strategic calculation? We'll never know. There are no statues to the unknown spy. No medals were ever awarded. His story doesn't appear in textbooks or popular documentaries. It exists only in the margins of history, in footnotes and half-sentences, acknowledged but never fully told. Perhaps that's fitting. Espionage is not a profession that invites recognition. The best operatives are the ones no one remembers, whose successes are measured not in accolades, but in the absence of disasters that might have been. This spy prevented nothing dramatic. He didn't stop an assassination. He didn't sabotage a weapons facility. He didn't warn of an impending attack. He simply took papers from one place to another. But those papers contained knowledge, and knowledge is the most enduring form of power. The Me-262's performance specifications allowed Allied engineers to understand exactly what was possible with jet propulsion. The Jumo 004 schematics revealed manufacturing techniques that could be adapted and improved. The combat reports provided tactical insights that shaped fighter doctrine for decades. In the hands of Allied engineers, that knowledge became the foundation of post-war aviation. The consequences of his actions ripple forward through every jet engine ever built, every fighter that breaks the sound barrier, every commercial aircraft that carries passengers across oceans at 40,000 feet. Modern aviation is built on his theft, and he vanished into silence. In 1993, the German government declassified a portion of the Reich Air Ministry's personnel records. Among the thousands of names were lists of employees who had been present in Berlin during the final weeks of the war. Cross-referencing those lists with post-war immigration records, death certificates, and military tribunal files, researchers identified hundreds of individuals who simply disappeared in April 1945. Most had been killed in the fighting, some had committed suicide, a few had been executed as deserters or traitors. But 11 individuals from the Aeronautical Engineering Division vanished without any record of death, capture, or post-war resettlement. 11 people who had access to classified aircraft documentation simply ceased to exist in any official capacity. One of them might have been the spy, or perhaps none of them were. Perhaps the spy wasn't on those lists at all, a janitor with a master key, a courier with a flexible route, a secretary who knew where the important files were kept. Intelligence operations don't always follow logical patterns. Sometimes the most important missions are carried out by people no one would suspect. Berlin, April 1945. A man walks out of a burning city carrying a briefcase. Inside are plans for a machine that could have changed the war, not changed the outcome perhaps. By April 1945, Germany's defeat was inevitable, but changed the duration, the cost, the shape of the endgame. He crosses a line, he hands them over. And then he's gone. No name, no grave, no recognition. Just the quiet knowledge that in the final days of the Third Reich, when the world was fracturing and history was being written in fire, someone made a choice to take the future out of Hitler's hands and give it to the world. The Me-262 was supposed to be Germany's salvation, a technological miracle that would reverse the tide of war. Instead, it became a lesson in the limits of technology divorced from strategy, resources, and time. But the knowledge it represented, the understanding of jet propulsion, high-speed aerodynamics, and the infrastructure required to manufacture such machines, that knowledge transcended the war that created it. It flew in different colors, under different flags, speaking different languages. It carried soldiers and civilians, weapons and cargo, exploration and commerce. It became the foundation of the modern world. And somewhere, a man whose name we don't know made that possible. He walked through chaos carrying papers. He crossed an invisible line between empires. He handed over the future and disappeared forever into history's silence.